So, so that's pretty much my main, thing we'll do today, lecture-wise, and we'll try to go through and discuss the major events of the Cold War. You can see behind me, of course, the Berlin Wall, which is starting to be torn down in 1989. You see there, it's really the end of the Cold War right there. So I'll try to at least get up to like the major points, and hopefully I can cram all this into one big lecture, which likely I probably won't review because it's going to be a long lecture likely for this one. So later I'm going to post this lecture to my YouTube channel. So I'll have it up likely on, of course, that Monday, November 23rd. So if you have any comments, questions like before, let me know about the lecture. If you have any comments about the class itself, just email me. If you have some kind of administrative type question for me, let me know, of course, later. So anyway, so like I said, I'm going to, of course, continue today with my last lecture, of course, on the Cold War era, which, of course, occurs right after World War II ends. So I think we had talked about this before, how, that occurred, they think, starting right after World War II, which is kind of debatable about when the Cold War started. I'll kind of define it a little bit later about what it is, the Cold War, but they think the Cold War started, they believe, I want to say maybe 1947. There's been sometimes a date about when it was, or 48. There's kind of a debate about when it actually started. It didn't actually start after the World War II ended right away. But the Cold War does go up to like the 1990s, like at least early 1990s. And like when the Cold War ended, I was like, I think just starting college. So to get an idea, and I think when the Berlin Wall fell itself, I had just graduated from high school. So that was about 18. This is something that's, of course, remembered since I was really young and all of that. But most historians think that the Cold War was basically started between like two different sides, like the two big superpowers that were kind of left after World War II. You had the United States on one side with her allies, and then, of course, you had the Soviet Union or USSR with their allies on the other side. And what was the Cold War? The Cold War was a geopolitical struggle. It was like a standoff, really, politically, economically, militarily, between those two sides, the United States, the Soviet Union, all their different allies. There are numerous occasions where World War III almost broke out. I think, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one event that almost did it. There are multiple. They had the Berlin Crisis. They had the Suez Crisis. Those are all different events that almost led to the Cold War actually breaking out. And the different sides had nicknames, like the Western side was called the Western Bloc, and all the countries that were in it. And then you had the Eastern Bloc, where you had all these different communist countries that were on the other side that were in support of the Soviet Union. And the Cold War almost led to nuclear war. Because of the nuclear arms race that, of course, occurred on both sides. And I can remember when I was a kid having to, duck and roll, basically get out of your chair, in school and, prepare for the nuclear bomb to blow up, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I remember that, Nowadays they might do a tornado drill or something like that, but we had to do that when we were kids, which was pretty scary. Now, let me get, of course, into one of the things that they think helped cause the Cold War to begin. There's multiple things of what led to the Cold War to start. One of the first, of course, was the formation of the United Nations. They think that kind of helped to actually start the Cold War a little bit. The UN was kind of like this replacement of the League of Nations, which is true about that. Another international type peace organization between different nations that was created to prevent like another big war from breaking out. And the idea was to create, diplomacy between countries to prevent conflicts, more or less. And the UN was actually founded by the winning allies in World War II. In fact, that's where the name United Nations comes from. The fact that it comes from the Allied countries that were together fighting against the Axis powers. And they actually originally founded the actual UN in San Francisco in California, but they later moved the headquarters, if you know about that, to New York, where it is now, New York City. That's where the headquarters is. I do have a picture of the actual building, the UN building, which is right there. The 5 main countries that founded the UN were often nicknamed the Big Five. That's what they called them. U.S., of course, in it, United States, Great Britain, the French were in it, France, China, which originally was the Republic of China, but later became the People's Republic of China, Soviet Union, and of course now, Russia today, of course. And so those are the 5 that actually started. All, of course, the winning allies, like I said, that basically, defeated the Axis powers in World War II. It does have this thing called the Security Council, which was pretty much controls a lot of the issues of the UN. There's, of course, 5 permanent members on it, if you know about that, which are all the Big Five: U.S., Britain, France, China, and Soviet Union, or Russia later. And so they enforce a lot of the policies of the Security Council. And one thing that is very famous about the Security Council, they have what they call veto power, where those 5 can veto basically like an issue or a resolution that comes up. And this is something that often causes a lot of conflicts in the UN, because you have this case eventually where U.S., Britain, and France are part of the Western Bloc, right? And then you got the USSR and China are with like communism in the Eastern Bloc. And so a lot of times they would veto each other and all that. And so that was something that definitely contributed to why, the Cold War actually started. Now, another big thing that was, also important with causing the Cold War was, of course, the Soviet Union, if you know about it, began to take over Eastern Europe. They took it over and they began converting that whole area into communism. You can see those are right there. Besides, the Soviet Union that's already communist, you've got Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria. All those areas would eventually become communist after World War II. And there was a famous saying now that was coined by Winston Churchill in 1946, which was the term Iron Curtain. And apparently what happened was Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, came to America and he gave a speech with President Truman that was there in Missouri. And he made this remark where he said basically that all of Eastern Europe was going communist. There's an iron curtain coming down pretty much. And he was right about that. And so the term stuck. And so that's one of the nicknames they often called the regions that's communist in mostly, especially Eastern Europe. They call it the Iron Curtain. So that's something that proves to be true for a long time, where that area is like, pretty much communist for 40-something years, for a long time. And one of the major issues that really led to why the Cold War started in Europe wasn't just because of that, but also because of the way Germany was divided after the war. Now, the division of Germany was a major reason for why the Cold War started, especially because of what they did with Berlin, how they divided it up and all that. And so what happened was the Western powers would eventually occupy like the western part of Germany. I've got a picture to show you of basically how they did it. But all those areas that are in green, orange, and blue, that was all occupied by the British, United States, and the French, which would be like what we call it later. They called it Western Germany, or West Germany, really is what they call it, West Germany. So yeah, West Germany, and then the red part you can see there, the Soviets would occupy that part where Berlin is. And that would be like the fourth zone. That would be, of course, East Germany. That would, of course, be created. So you have these two states that were created. They actually had real names to them, by the way, but I'll get to that in a second. But West Germany, of course, proved to be more to the west, democratic, capitalist. So it was part of the Western Bloc countries and all that. And the East Germany would be, of course, communist, socialist, and under the Soviet umbrella of the Soviet Union and what they call the Eastern Bloc countries, which was later part of what they call the Warsaw Pact, as they called it. And what happened on top of that was they divided Berlin up too, as well. And so West Berlin was occupied by France, Britain, and the United States. And then East Berlin was divided up by the Soviet Union. This is all within the East Germany part, which was really crazy about it. And that created a lot of problems, of course, later. And as you know, what happened later, the communist side would build the Berlin Wall to encircle what is West Berlin to prevent people from leaving, because a lot of people use West Berlin to escape from the East because they didn't want to be under communism. Oh, those were the real names that they called West Germany and East Germany: Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, German Democratic Republic of East Germany. But a lot of people didn't call it that, both of them that. They called it West Germany, East Germany, pretty much. And later it'll be pretty much divided, you can see, basically for about 40 years. And then eventually in 1990, they'll be, of course, reunited. Another thing, of course, that was an issue I did want to talk about that occurred, of course, in the Cold War was, I think I did all of that right there. But I think here it is right in that slide right there. But I did want to talk about what happened with the spread of communism that occurs next. And what happened was Truman eventually came up with what is called the Truman Doctrine. And this actually was caused by the fact that Greece and Turkey was being threatened by communism. This is like right after World War II. And we started giving military aid to those countries, and also public, economic type aid as well, which was in the tune of like $400 million. And it's kind of getting more into American history here, but President Truman responded with what they call the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was one of the first policies to try to really stop the spread of communism, which helped start the Cold War. And it was actually something that was developed by George Kennan, who was a U.S. diplomat. He came up with the idea to try to do that. And that was initially what we first tried to do with that. And it later led to what they call the Marshall Plan, about this after World War II, where starting in 1948, the United States decided to give economic aid to Western Europe to help rebuild and get back on their feet after World War II. We spent something like $12 billion to $13 billion to help these countries out and rebuild them. It was actually called the Economic Recovery Plan, but it was named after George C. Marshall, who was the Secretary of State under Truman. And they think they also developed the Marshall Plan to really prevent communism from spreading, because there was a fear that if we didn't help out Western Europe, Central Europe, that it would all go communist. So that's pretty much the reason for it. And yeah, Marshall was the reason why they, of course, he was the guy that helped run it and all that and won the Nobel Peace Prize. Then in 1948, they had a very famous incident that happened, of course, with over West Berlin. And what happened was Stalin decided in June of 1948 to blockade West Berlin. Why did he do this? He wanted to take over West Berlin and have control of all of Berlin. Because I told you, people were trying to escape and go to the West. And he wanted capitalist democratic influence in East Germany and all that. And so that's what happened. And so Stalin basically blockaded everything. He blockaded the roads, all the canals, any kind of waterways. They blockaded the railways, shut the railways down. So he wanted to leave, the western zone of West Berlin to get to West Germany, you couldn't. There was no way out, well, except one way, the air, of course, as you know. And so one of the most famous things that happened at the beginning of the Cold War was the so-called Berlin airlift that happened in 1948 to 1949. And so what happened was the Americans, British, French, and other allies, I guess, in the West started flying these sorties to bring in like supplies to supply the West with food and whatever else they needed, coal, etc. They flew from West Germany into West Berlin, into East Germany to do this. They actually flew something like, I don't know if you have to know all this right here, but they flew something like 200,000 sorties in something like, I think it was like 10 months or something like that, which is ridiculous, which is like equivalent to like 92 million miles they flew back and forth to basically, and I don't know, I guess if they would have shot down some of our planes, which I guess they could have, you could have been looking at World War III with that issue. And so one of the things that, of course, happened afterwards because of this was because NATO formed. NATO. And the United States decided that they had had enough of what Stalin was trying to do. And so they formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which became this alliance between states that were in the Northern Atlantic, U.S., Canada, and most of western parts of Europe were all basically in it. You can see the map here. Besides U.S., Canada included like Spain, France, Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, West Germany, Austria, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Norway. Those are all the countries that are pretty much in it today, and still in it today, by the way. And maybe some other ones in Europe, too, that have joined as well after that. But yeah, that alliance formed. And of course, a few years later, what happened, if you know about it, NATO alliance eventually caused what they call the Warsaw Pact to form, which is later in 1955, formed in Warsaw in Poland. And what happened was all the different Eastern Bloc countries joined together, like I talked about, what you see in red there. They kind of formed an alliance against each other, which included, you can see, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and the Soviet Union. And if those two would have attacked each other, you would have had World War III break out. So that's something that never happened, but it could have happened, more or less. All right, let me move on to talk about what happened next. Like when you get more into like the late 40s and into the 50s, they have what they call the Red Scare that happened, which really peaks in the 1950s. The Red Scare, these they call the second Red Scare because there's two of these that happened, of course. And what happened was in the United States, people began to become concerned that communism was going to take over the country because it had spread to like Eastern Europe and all that. And then it also spread in Asia as well, which I'll get to later, a little bit later, but it does do that. And so people kind of get paranoid about it and think that communism is going to take over. Yeah, you got a bunch of stuff here. So Eastern Europe's going communist. The Soviets are getting the atomic bomb like we got it also as well. Both even have the hydrogen bomb, of course, later, which is scary. China goes communist in 1949. North Korea also goes communist also as well. So you have all this kind of going on as examples. There were cases where some Americans were accused of spying. One of the most famous you may have heard about was the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs, if you know about it, were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union, giving them like secrets, like nuclear secrets and other secrets. I think they gave some radar secrets and things like that to the Soviet Union. And they were later found guilty of it, if you know about this. And they were actually put on trial, found guilty, and then later, if you know about it, which is amazing, they were executed. Both of them were for treason. You don't see that much anymore, people being executed for treason anymore. I don't know last time that happened exactly. But both got the electric chair in 1953. Although they think there's a debate about maybe the fact that possibly Ethel was innocent about it. But a lot of people didn't like the Rosenbergs. There was other people, like, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy named Alger Hiss. I think around 1950 was another guy accused of being also a communist in the State Department. So he had all kinds of things like that, of course, going on. You may have heard of the, like in American history, they had like this deal with Joseph McCarthy, started this witch hunt in the United States where he went after communists and all that. And McCarthy was this senator from, I think, Wisconsin, I believe, and he started a witch hunt of people in the early 1950s, which he believed were in the government. And he had like hearings, which were on TV, where people would be forced to be grilled by him. And they were asked, are you a communist? And things like that. And people go, I'll take the Fifth Amendment. That's what usually people would say because they don't want to be incriminated and all that. They also had like the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was kind of similar to it, where the same thing went on. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on. And of course, the term they used for that later is McCarthyism, about the whole term in the 1950s where people were accused of communism. And some people kind of saw it as a witch hunt, but they now think that McCarthy was actually kind of right. He's been kind of vindicated, about that in the last couple of years. They think there were people that were communists and probably still are. There's probably communists in the government still. I think there are today that are kind of radical that I wish they would get rid of. But, anyway. But yeah, they're still there, probably. He's probably right about that. Of course, the other thing that happened that scared the hell out of people a lot, like I told you, was the United States and the Soviet Union both got hydrogen bombs that were developed in the early 50s, like 1952, 53. Both sides eventually got the hydrogen bomb, which is a type of fusion weapon that used hydrogen instead of like plutonium or uranium. And Edward Teller, who was from Hungary, who came to America, was the physicist that helped design it. My dad told me years ago, he actually met the guy, talked to him a few times, came to LSU for a few things and meetings or something like that, and actually met him. Interesting about that. But yeah, the first hydrogen bomb was actually exploded in 1953. They call it Operation Ivy Mike. And in the Marshall Islands, they exploded the first hydrogen bomb, which was huge. I think the hydrogen bomb was like 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And what's scary is the next year, the Soviets somehow got it too, as well. So you got to wonder if it's a bunch of spies in the government and they were giving them information and all that. So you got to wonder about that. Because both sides had spies. They were on both sides, in the Cold War, giving information away. Then, of course, the other thing that happened that was scary, about the Cold War is Asia. Asia also, went communist as well. People start talking, if you know about the Cold War, they start talking about the domino theory, of course, which I'll mention about the domino theory was a very popular theory in America and other countries, where if one country went communist, they would all go communist. This is something they started thinking, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Asia. Like if one country went communist, they would all go communist. And like in Asia, like I said, they had different countries that went communist. The first one, of course, was China. China went communist in 1949 with the so-called People's Republic of China that formed. And it started when the Civil War broke out between the Republican Chinese, who were not communist, and then the communists that were led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, of course, who I've got a picture of right here. He would later found the People's Republic of China. There he is right there in 1949. He was a dictator, Mao Zedong, who killed, by the way, a lot of people in his country, kind of like Stalin did. So he did kind of the same kind of policies that Stalin did with collectivization and all that. And Chiang Kai-shek, who had been the president or ruler of Republic of China, he was actually run out of China. He was forced to flee to, they actually call it Formosa. Now they call it Taiwan today. And that actually helped create tensions between both sides in the Cold War because, like for a long time, the UN wouldn't even recognize the new China as being communist. They would say, Republic of China, Taiwan, you're China, that kind of thing. And eventually, they eventually did recognize them later. But Mao Zedong, like I said, would form this state and would begin to convert all of the whole country to communism. And it was more like a peasant form of communism, basically. But he would start that Chinese Cultural Revolution and collectivize the country. And they think his actual collectivization would end up causing mass starvation like it did the Soviet Union. I think somewhere like, what was it about that died? Like 40 million or more, I think, died in China after he did all this stuff. So you have that right there. Then the other thing that happened that's real famous in the Cold War, which is moving more into, like I said, the 50s right now in the Cold War, you had, of course, the so-called Korean War, which the Korean War was really one of the first hot wars that broke out in the Cold War. Because if you know about the Cold War, it had a lot of these proxy wars between the Democratic and Communist sides they had. And what happened was the Soviet Union, with Chinese also help as well, influenced the foundations of what we call North Korea, which became a communist state, way more influenced by the Soviet Union. And it became known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, founded about 1948, that state. Its capital would be Pyongyang. And then so you had that. And before that, Japan had controlled that whole area. Japan had controlled the Korean Peninsula. They left, basically. And so that state forms. And the guy that founded North Korea was a dictator named Kim Il-sung, the Kim family, which I think they're on the third one right now. And third ruler, was it Kim Il-jung or something like that is his name? Anyway, so the Soviet Union helped create that state. Then the United States also helped create their state that was more capitalist and democratic, which became the Republic of Korea, which was simply called South Korea. So you got these two states, North and South Korea, which were created. Pyongyang, like I said, was the capital of North Korea. Capital of South Korea, of course, is Seoul, which both are pretty much still separate today. And the first president of South Korea was Syngman Rhee, who was basically like a right-wing type political leader. And then, of course, the other guy, Kim Il-sung, was like a communist, type dictator. So you got these two sides that are basically there. Both states, by the way, were divided, if you know about this, at the 38th parallel. And they're still close to being divided at the 38th parallel. Not exactly at the 38th parallel, but that's where they're currently divided, with a demilitarized zone, of course, in the middle. Of course, what happened, if you know about it, in the 1950s, starting in 1950, the Korean War broke out. It's considered, like I said, one of the first big hot wars that occurs. They think that Stalin and the Soviet Union egged on North Korea to invade South Korea, because I think the idea was they wanted to take the control of the whole peninsula of Korea and form a communist state out of it. Just what North Vietnam wanted with South Vietnam. And anyway, so that broke out. And what happened was the North Koreans, using mostly Soviet hardware, military hardware, would eventually overrun South Korea. They actually took the capital of South Korea, Seoul, and then drove down to the bottom of the peninsula to close to where the city of Busan is, which is a South Korean city near the bottom of South Korea. And at that point, the UN decided to intervene. If you study about it, the Korean War was one of the first major conflicts that the United Nations intervened in right after World War II. And the United Nations eventually got General Douglas MacArthur to come in as the main commander of the UN forces, which were mostly, by the way, American. I think like 90% of the forces that fought on the South Korean side were basically American with the UN. And MacArthur, he was at the time in Japan, because the U.S. was kind of trying to rebuild Japan after the war. He decided to come up with a military plan to save South Korea. And he decided to make this amphibious attack or assault on Incheon, which I'll show you in a map where that is. It's on the west coast of, which is right here. You can see it right here. But he would basically, using like U.S. Navy and all that, they would attack here on the west coast of South Korea, and then drive the North Koreans out back into North Korea right there. And of course, if you know about it, it worked. It was very successful. So we were able to seize that west coast, force the North Koreans back northward, back into their state. We even actually took their capital. We took the capital of Pyongyang at that point, started driving all the way up back into China. We were going to drive into China, I think is what we were going to do, and then take over all the whole peninsula, I think was the plan. However, what happened was at the end of 1950, about November, December 1950, the Chinese decided to enter the war and support North Korea because they feel like North Korea was going to get overrun. There wouldn't be a communist state there anymore. And so that totally changed the war forever after that, because what happened was with the North Koreans and Chinese fighting together, they drove us, the UN side, back down again, back into South Korea. You can see where it actually got driven down to, it's like in this map, they drove them back down to about right here. And then we eventually, the UN force then drove them back up to where this line is over time. And the Korean War became a stalemate. Like neither side could really win. Korea, I guess, because you have China and the U.S. of course involved in the war, but eventually they would sue for peace in 1953, and the war never really officially ended. It was like just like a ceasefire kind of thing, which I think President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, was the one that got the war to end in 1953. But basically, both countries are still today divided at the 38th parallel. So they have a demilitarized zone that's there. And still the tensions are kind of uneasy between, both sides. So Eisenhower was the guy that helped stop it, they think. But yeah, like no treaty was ever signed, and they have this DMZ that's set up between both sides that's now there. And so the Korean conflict is kind of in itself still going on. They're still fighting the war, I guess, sort of, communist versus democratic side. And so there's totally two different countries there. It's so weird. Makes you wonder if they'll have another war one day, like a real war. Anyway. All right. So anyway, let me, of course, move on. I need to, of course, talk about what were some of the other things that happened also in the Cold War as well. So, yeah, we need to get moving on more towards the into more of the late 50s and into the 60s as well. So one of the next things that happens, of course, that Stalin died in 1953. And of course, they had a new leader that came in named Nikita Khrushchev. He came in and took over the Soviet Union. And one thing that's famous about Khrushchev that's well known was that he's the one that came in and started trying to get rid of Stalin's policies, which were too radical. This became known as de-Stalinization, which de-Stalinization was some policies that basically were there to reform the Soviet Union, eliminate Stalin's cult of personality. They closed all the gulags. Yeah, they did, supposedly, at that time. And so they tried to become more open with the West and to create more, maybe even some democratic reforms later could maybe come later, they think. So So the West is thinking, hey, we might have democracy coming soon, and maybe even capitalism coming soon. With all these ideas that Khrushchev is trying to do, but a lot of that proved to be kind of wrong, as you know. And apparently, de-Stalinization gave people kind of the wrong message in some countries, like in Eastern Europe. And what happened was it inspired the Hungarian Revolution to break out in October of 1956, which you probably heard about this. And mostly it was led by college students that rebelled. I think their government eventually got involved, and they wanted to have more, freedoms and political rights at that point. And what happened was the Soviet Union decided that they started freaking out because basically you might be looking at this country going democratic or capitalist at that point. And so Khrushchev decided to intervene, and at that point the Red Army had been pushed out even by some of the freedom fighters. And so what happened was Khrushchev eventually set the Red Army back in. They crushed it. That's basically what happened. Over 3,000 Hungarians were killed. A lot of them were even deported to the Soviet Union, were imprisoned. Maybe the gulags weren't closed. and then some of them fled the country. They fled like the West, which a lot of Hungarians came to like the United States later, of course, because of that. So Khrushchev was not exactly, I always joke that he's like Stalin light, was basically who Khrushchev really was. So all these different events start happening, like the Hungarian Revolution. Also, they had another incident that happened at the same time in 1956, which was the Suez Crisis. That happened next, which almost caused World War III. And what happened was in what is Egypt, the Egyptians decided to nationalize and seize control of the Suez Canal, which had been built, I think, by the French and others, like European powers. They had controlled it. And this really angered the West. This is all under President Gamal Nasser, this occurs. And so France, Britain, and also Israel, the state of Israel, which had already formed at that point, eventually attacked and seized control of the peninsula and tried to take control of the Suez Canal from them. They take it from them. By that time, Egypt and Nasser was starting to kind of open up to like the Soviet Union, which you see a lot with a lot of these Middle Eastern countries later in the Cold War. And over like a 2-day period, October 28th to 29th, with those Western countries and Israel seizing control of the canal, Soviet Union decided to intervene. They threatened war if they didn't take their forces out. And Dwight Eisenhower, who's president of the United States in the 50s, got really angry about this because he didn't really know this was going to happen. Like the French, British, and Israel did this. And so he told them to back down because he didn't want World War III. And so that was something that was avoided in 1956. But there was numerous times where, World War III could have broken out. We could have intervened in Hungary, which they asked us to, the Hungarians, but we couldn't, because it would have meant World War III and all that. There was a deal later in 1959 where Khrushchev actually came to the United States. This is something true. He was the first Soviet leader to actually visit the United States, and he met with Dwight Eisenhower and his wife. And he also did this tour, about it, like over 2 weeks, where he went across the country. And for some reason, Khrushchev wanted to visit like a bunch of farms. He was like kind of like a farmer, really, the way it looks. He's kind of a buffoon, Khrushchev, which he was. And it was a big media circus, and he was really mad because he wanted to visit Disneyland in California, and they wouldn't let him. That's kind of weird. But anyway, what happened was they were going to, like the U.S. and Soviet Union was going to have a bunch of summit meetings to discuss peace between them to prevent, I guess, war from breaking out and all that. But what happened was in 1960, in May, they had this incident called the U-2 incident that occurred. And what happened was the Soviet Union shot down one of our spy planes that was flying over the Soviet Union. Yeah, we were spying on the Soviet Union. And apparently a SAM missile, they think, shot down a Lockheed U-2 spy plane, and they caught the pilot. We thought the pilot was dead, but he wasn't. His name was Francis Gary Powers, who worked for the CIA. He was caught, and it became a real bad embarrassment between both of us. And so that helped to create a lot of tensions between the United States, of course, and the Soviet Union, which would continue under, like, when John F. Kennedy would become president in the early 1960s later. So that's something that really helped to really cause a lot of problems. So yeah, that's basically, what occurred with that. One more thing that's not in there, I don't have it in there, but there's another thing, of course, that also they talk about too, that as well mentioned, that was another tension in the Cold War, if you know about this, is the space race. That's another thing that was actually a big tension between us and the Soviet Union. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was one of the first, satellites launched into space. And that was another issue which caused a lot of tensions because both sides started to develop space program, but also we started to realize that they could launch an atomic bomb at us using like nuclear missile. And so both start stockpiling nuclear missiles, all that, of course, later. So that's one of the scary things about the Cold War was also that as well. Also, they had this other thing called the Berlin Crisis that happened too, which happened starting around 1961, 62. And what happened was the Soviet Union and Khrushchev with East Germany decided to build the Berlin Wall, which the Berlin Wall was this wall that was constructed around West Berlin in East Germany, which would prevent people from escaping. And it got so bad that both sides started facing off with tanks and stuff, because of the wall, being built at that point. And of course, this has happened under John F. Kennedy's administration. So you get this case where near the U.S. checkpoint into West Germany right here, and as you're looking over there, East Germany over here, both sides had tanks facing each other, which I guess they were shot at each other. You would have had World War III break out, right here. That's Checkpoint Charlie, they called it, of course, back in the Cold War. And so that was a major event that, of course, happened, in the Cold War. So we almost had World War III with the Berlin Crisis when they built the wall. Here, of course, is a picture of the Berlin Wall, which was built later. And the Berlin Wall, of course, was a major symbol of the Cold War era. It really was. When it got torn down, they think it kind of helped to eventually end the Cold War overall. Now, the other thing that happened, of course, that's very famous about the Cold War, you, of course, have the peak of the Cold War as well that you have. And so that's like the big symbol of it, of course, with that. But they had the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you know, that occurs. And that's considered one of the most famous events, really, that occurs in, of course, the Cold War era. They think that actual event almost led to World War III. And, of course, part of the reason why it happened, of course, was because of Fidel Castro. He had seized power in Cuba by the end of 1958 with the so-called Cuban Revolution. Got a picture of Castro, which is right here. Castro, of course, was the communist leader of Cuba for many years. You can see he was in power for like over 50 years. It's a long time, basically like a dictator. And what happened was Castro overthrew a right-wing dictator we backed named Fulgencio Batista. He fled the country. He took over. What happened that shocked us, of course, was that Castro then aligned with the Soviet Union. That's when all the problems really started. And under John F. Kennedy, they tried to get rid of him, if you know about this. The U.S. actually had this operation that was called Bay of Pigs invasion, which happened in April of 1961, where we tried to overthrow Castro with this invasion. We thought if we invaded, that the people would basically back the invasion and the coup over Castro, but they didn't. And of course, the invasion failed miserably. And the CIA tried to assassinate Castro numerous times. Operation Mongoose, I think they called it. And they never could kill off Castro. So that was a big, big problem. And then Khrushchev was concerned that basically if they didn't help out, Castro in Cuba, that they might invade. And so that's why the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And so what happened was the United States in 1962 discovered the fact that they had these missile sites that were photographs were taken up by spy planes. And so that leads to a major incident between us and, of course, the Soviet Union, of course. And so, yeah, they discover these missile sites that are in Cuba. And so what JFK does, John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time of the United States, he decided to basically put a blockade on Cuba to prevent, conflict from occurring. And so that was actually the right thing to do. I think a lot of JFK's generals wanted to invade. It's what they really wanted to do. They invade Cuba, but it became this standoff between both sides, where we blockaded basically Cuba with our Navy, like a quarantine or blockade or embargo, whatever you want to call it. And Khrushchev eventually backed down in early November of 1962. And so both sides avoided war. They definitely think that it would have caused World War III. And my dad was actually in the Air Force at the time, U.S. Air Force in 1962. He was actually stationed in Florida. So he would have been right there if it would have, the war would have happened. Well, I guess if it would have happened, I wouldn't be here, that kind of thing. So that was definitely the most scariest aspect of the whole Cuban Missile Crisis overall. I've got a few minutes. Let me also talk about the Vietnam War as well. Vietnam War, of course, was considered to be one of the most famous events that really happened in the Cold War. It was one of those hot wars that happened, in the Cold War. Really, the Korean War and the Vietnam War are the two biggest hot wars that you really had overall. And of course, I told you that part of why the Vietnam War happened, kind of like the Korean War, was because of the domino theory I told you about. And of course, there was a theory that Southeast Asia was going to go all communist, Indochina, because one country, you already saw North Korea, China. So the theory was if, Vietnam went communist, so would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, all those countries and all that. And so the Vietnam War became kind of like this proxy war that was fought between the West and the communist forces, which the peak of the war was actually really two wars they had, but the peak of the war is really 1955 to 1975, but the war itself went back to right after World War II, believe it or not, with the first Indochina War, which broke out around 1946. And I don't know if you know much about Vietnam and Indochina back then, but the French tried to come back after World War II and take over like Indochina, which they had been there before, the French. And when they went in there, though, some of the Vietnamese had become communist, which had formed an organization that was called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh was this independence movement founded by Ho Chi Minh, who had, by the way, had gone to the Soviet Union and had become a communist. And so they wanted to basically create an independent state there and basically kick out any forms of imperialism, like the French and other powers, pretty much. Later, the Viet Minh would want to have an independent, like Vietnam. That's what they wanted. It was one of the main goals they had. And France didn't put enough forces there. I think they even wanted us to support them, but they eventually lost to the Viet Minh in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. And so they were forced to withdraw from Indochina. And of course, what happened later, as you know, is the United States would step in and start getting involved, of course, by the late 50s, early 60s. And right after the French left, what occurred was that they split that whole area of Indochina into two states, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And both states, by the way, were divided at what they call the 17th parallel, is where it was. And you had North Vietnam, of course, which was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And then you had the South Vietnam, which was called the Republic of Vietnam. But nobody really calls them that. They call them North and South Vietnam, kind of like Korea, same thing. The northern state, North Vietnam, of course, was led by Ho Chi Minh. So he became the president, of course, of North Vietnam, which he would be throughout most of the conflict up to 1969. And then South Vietnam was led by Ngo Dinh Diem. He was in power until 1963. He was actually assassinated. South Vietnam was more of a democratic capitalist type state, and the one in the north was more of a communist state. And people in the north actually fled to the south. There was cases where when this happened, they actually fled to the south. And what happened was under American presidents, mostly Eisenhower and then Kennedy, we began to support it more. South Vietnam sent advisors, military equipment to help fight the North. And over time, what happened, the United States got involved because of an incident that happened in the Gulf of Tonkin called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's believed to be an incident where one of the United States' destroyers, the USS Maddox, I think it was another ship called the Turner Joy also as well, they think was fired on by North Vietnamese gunboats. They actually think it might not have happened because it happened at night. They thought they saw something on radar, and so they shot at them. And so maybe not. They're not sure. I think there's a debate about whether it really happened or not. But Lyndon B. Johnson, who was president at the time, he decided to intervene because of this, get involved. And so what happened was the United States got involved in Vietnam through what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically allowed us to send troops there. And it was an undeclared war. It was like what they call a police action, where we kind of intervened. And within the next few years, between 1965 to 1968, the U.S. at one point had close to 500,000 troops there, like 500,000 eventually compiled there, fighting in South Vietnam. And we had to fight two different enemies. We, of course, fought the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, which were like regular forces. And they also had what they call the Viet Cong, which also fought in the South, which were guerrilla forces called the NLF, or what they call the National Liberation Front. And the American forces fought with the South Vietnamese forces, which is called ARVN, which is the Army of Republic of Vietnam. So we had our hands full pretty much fighting them. The Viet Cong, that was the problem. That's what made the war so difficult, because the Viet Cong could be anywhere, throughout South Vietnam. They pretty much infiltrated all throughout South Vietnam. It could be any city or any village where they could be. And so the Vietnam War, the front lines were basically just everywhere, anywhere throughout, the South. Fighting might break out at any time. And one of the things that made it very difficult was the North Vietnam started using what they call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you know about this, it was this trail that they ran through Laos and Cambodia. It was more like a trade route, I guess, if you want to call it that. They basically used that to supply their forces in the South and attack into the South. And so it made it very difficult for American side and the South Vietnamese side to really win the war because of that. And of course, the United States started bombing that area. If you know about that area, like we're on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was one of the most bombed places ever in the world. I think they dropped more bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail than all the bombs that they dropped on, like in World War II. It was ridiculous. And there's still a lot of bombs. I think we'll read an article about this, but there's millions of bombs throughout that area, like in Vietnam and parts of that area, Laos, Cambodia, that have never detonated. They're just underground, just sitting there, which is really crazy. But it basically, it helped the North win the war. And also the fact that, the war started to become unpopular, like in the United States, the war became very unpopular. Vietnam and the Vietnam War. Of course, if you know about the Vietnam War, it was often called the helicopter war because of helicopters being used quite a lot to go everywhere throughout South Vietnam. There, of course, there's some American and ARVN soldiers together fighting right there. Anyway, the peak of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive. You know about this in 1968. And that was when the North Vietnamese with the Viet Cong did these sneak attacks all throughout South Vietnam, which were coordinated around the Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year. And of course, we didn't know it was coming. And the American side with South Vietnam actually won. We won the Tet offensive. We defeated it. But what happened was people started to think after Tet that the war was unwinnable. And so it became very, very unpopular. People began to protest against the war and all of that in the United States. And so eventually it forced the United States to kind of find a way to try to end the war. And Richard Nixon was the last president that had to really deal with, I guess, the end of the war. That and Gerald Ford later. But Nixon came up with this idea to bomb North Vietnam, like bomb them like Hanoi and all that, and force them to the negotiating table. And that's how the war eventually ended in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords that were signed, which effectively allowed us to get out of the war. So after that, the U.S. began withdrawing our troops from Vietnam. This became known as Vietnamization, I think was the term we used in the United States, for where the United States withdrew our forces from South Vietnam, and we let South Vietnam fight the war by themselves against the North. With our training and military equipment, we thought that maybe they could hold the North and all that after that treaty was signed, but that's not what happened. If you know about it, and eventually what occurred was that South Vietnam eventually fell to the North. In 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, which, by the way, shocked us. We didn't know that was going to happen. In Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell on April 30th, 1975. And so the United States eventually was forced to evacuate American and South Vietnamese that were associated with the South Vietnamese regime and all that. They all got out. And in the end, North Vietnam took South Vietnam, and they basically unified it as one state, which is now called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam today. So that's basically I guess the war in itself was a failure, because the whole country ended up unifying as a communist state, like it is today. But our relations with Vietnam has gotten pretty good. I think both sides are considered, we're pretty much real friendly, because I think Vietnam realizes that, China is the real enemy now. I know the Vietnamese don't really like the Chinese. I know that for sure. But yeah, there's a lot of people that protested against the war, which of course is well known. There were atrocities that were committed on the American side. They were kind of well known that they found out at the end of the war. You may have heard about the My Lai massacre that was well known, which came out in, I think, 1971. I think when it came out, it was kind of, a tragic story about that. There was also a case where American students were shot dead, like Kent State University, where you had American students that were shot for protesting against the war. These are, of course, later pictures at the end of the war, where they had the evacuation of Saigon, which happened in 1975. That's probably one of the most famous pictures ever taken, where you've got people being evacuated from the U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam, right here. All right, yeah, let me move on to talk about, I've got a few minutes left. Let me go ahead and talk about what happened at the end of the war, Cold War, real quick. Now, the Cold War would end eventually due to a lot of policies in the 1970s and 80s. They had what they called détente. Détente was this easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which began to occur. And they had things like the SALT agreements, which you may have heard about. SALT 1, I think it was actually SALT 2, which never really came about. But the SALT agreement was this agreement to limit stockpiles of nuclear weapons. So you have a case where up to this time in the 70s, up to like Gorbachev, there's a case where both sides start to limit their stockpiles of nuclear weapons to prevent, World War III from literally breaking out at that point. And most historians seem to think that the main president that helped to really, help end the Cold War was a guy named Ronald Reagan, who I'll get to later. Reagan's going to be the guy that really they think his policies that really kind of helps to end the Cold War. And I want to talk about, of course, one of the most famous political leaders at the time that was under Soviet Union, which was Brezhnev. Brezhnev, of course, was one of the last major Soviet leaders before Gorbachev that came in, second longest reigning. And Brezhnev tried to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. He did this by trying to prevent the spread of democracy, the spread of capitalism throughout Eastern Europe. And Brezhnev even came up with this doctrine called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was a type of doctrine where if a country was even threatened with even trying to go capitalist or democrat, they could basically intervene militarily to keep it communist. And this happened actually in Czechoslovakia in 1968, where the state, like the government, the people, tried to rebel and basically create a more democratic state. It was called the Prague Spring. And so Brezhnev sent troops in there and crushed it basically. So that was a good example right there of the Brezhnev Doctrine. He also used it in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he eventually invaded there also as well in December of 1979. This caused the so-called Soviet-Afghan War, which would last for about 12 years until 1991. And they think that the Afghanistan War, the Soviets, was one of those conflicts that really helped, cause the decline of the Soviet Union. They kind of call that the Soviets' Vietnam conflict, more or less. And the United States responded by supporting Afghan rebels. They are called the Mujahideen, like Osama bin Laden, who was on that side. And we supported them with arms and money, basically. Like I said, Ronald Reagan, he was one of the main individuals that really helped to end the Cold War. Reagan was the 40th president of the United States, and his policies really helped to end the Cold War overall. And he stopped doing détente. So this isn't working, but to defeat them. And about Reagan, Reagan was the one that called the Soviet Union, he called it the evil empire, and it needed to be crushed. And so he did this in different ways. One way they did was they started an arms race with the Soviet Union. And they developed programs like Star Wars, the Star Wars program, or SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which was this idea to create like a nuclear umbrella, where if the Soviets launched a missile at us, we could knock it down with like satellites that have missiles and things like that. And so these are ideas that Reagan came up with. But eventually when Mikhail Gorbachev came in and became president, Reagan decided to basically negotiate with him. That maybe he could help to ease the tensions and maybe, lead to the end of the Cold War and all of that. And Gorbachev was the last communist leader of the Soviet Union, because it collapsed in 1991. In fact, he was eventually president of the Soviet Union, the only one they had. And Gorbachev came up with these new ideas to change the Soviet Union, hoping to maybe save it at this point internally. And he came up with these two ideas that were forms called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was an idea that meant openness, the back idea that they would try to create more democratic reforms in the country, give people more rights and things like that. And then perestroika was an idea called restructuring, where what they would do is they would actually allow some capitalism, like in Soviet Union. And of course, they actually think that these ideas backfired and helped actually to end the Soviet Union. So it did throw it like that joke on the right, a little cartoon, and actually the opposite of what it really did. Then, of course, what happened next, if you know about it, was in the by the 1980s, the Cold War started to come to an end. And of course, one of the big things that led to it was in the 1980s, the ideas of democracy and capitalism took off. It spread throughout Eastern Europe, started really in Poland and Hungary were the two countries that really, the first that did it really, and then it spread all the other ones. And so by the 1989, they think that's when the Cold War started really to end with the Berlin Wall being torn down. It was torn down between 89 and 1990. And so that really is one of the main things that really was the catalyst that really led to the end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall really signaled that more or less. And then basically 2 years later, December 1991, you've got the Soviet Union that also collapsed as well. So that's basically the end of the Cold War. So the Cold War usually ends about 1991. It's about roughly. So the Cold War itself lasted about 40, 50 years is the time range of what we're talking about. Then, of course, you've got the post-Cold War era that we're kind of in now. Those are all the different events, of course, that have occurred, in more modern times here today. You've got the Gulf War, where Iraq invaded Kuwait, and you had Operation Desert Storm, which basically got them out. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which already did, which happened in 1991, 92. Basically, all those countries break up, into separate independent states. Break up of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a country, of course, that was a communist state in the Cold War. It broke out. Rwanda, genocide happened in Africa. U.S. going alone policy. They're talking about us, going alone against terrorism in Iraq. You got the 9/11 or September attacks that you have as well. All these different events that follow. War on terrorism, of course, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Problems with Iran and North Korea, nuclear problems there as well. Lately, of course, our other big problems we've had too. The Great Recession, of course, another event in 2007 to 2009. And now I guess the main thing now that we have today is the coronavirus that's affecting, I guess, us today all across the world and all that. So those are just some of the different things that are really still going on, I guess, in the modern world. More like current events, more than anything overall. So that's pretty much my lecture on the Cold War. I'm probably not going to review because it's such a long lecture, but you can go back and, of course, look at this lecture multiple times. But want to remind you before I go, lecture-wise or class-wise, really, that don't forget about the remaining assignments you've got. I think primarily you've got just the final vocab to turn in by Monday, November 30th. But if anybody's doing the Veterans Oral History Project, that's due also Monday, November 30th. And I am going to try to post the final exam for you to start on tomorrow, which is on Monday, November 23rd. Looks like it. Hey, today's the day John F. Kennedy got shot. You know that? November 22nd. Interesting about that. That was a Cold War thing happened too. Interesting about that. But so I'm going to have that posted for you tomorrow. I'll probably have an announcement in Canvas about the final exam. I am going to have the final up until looks like Thursday, December 3rd. So I'm going to give you extra time on it to get it done. So don't tell me any excuses that you can't get it done by, that Thursday, December 3rd. So that's it for the semester. It's too bad we couldn't meet face-to-face or anything like that. I don't know if we'll ever have face-to-face classes. I guess maybe we will one day. But anyway, so y'all have a good rest of the semester. I hope you have a good Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and all that. And like I said, if you have any questions about the lecture, let me know about it, about today's lecture. You can basically send me comments, questions through my YouTube channel and all that. So that's it. Hope y'all have a good rest of the week and finals coming up. So take care and all that. So y'all take care.